kick off?
Sure.
I think we should be live. Yes, we are. So, hello everyone, welcome. It's been a bit of a summer gap. Well, things slow down in summer. Actually, in this case, it's the opposite. They've sped up in terms of sword studies and stuff, but it was a good time to take a break for a few weeks. So we're back on the first live stream post-summer with Maciej Talaga. And thank you for joining. I think it's going to be a really, really interesting talk. So, by the way, today we're going to end slightly earlier than usual. We usually tend to hit the 2-hour mark. I think for tonight we set ourselves 1 hour and a half. So if you have questions, you're more than welcome to start shooting them right away so that we are able to address them. So, Maciej, thank you for joining. And would you like to introduce yourself and tell us a bit about you?
Sure, of course. And first of all, thank you for having me. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Maciej Talaga, and I'm by training, I'm an archaeologist and an anthropologist. I hold a doctoral degree in both disciplines, and I'm currently an assistant professor at the University of Warsaw. And I'm lucky enough to be able to pursue there research that is connected to, well, my other passion, that is historical European martial arts, because I deal with martial arts anthropology, including martial arts based on intangible cultural heritage, of which HEMA is actually a part, or at least it can be argued that it is a part, even though it's perhaps not like, universally accepted, but I think it's defensible. So that's one thing. I also deal with intangible cultural heritage that still exists. So I did research, and I'm still trying to pursue a research project that is centered on documenting and preserving and reviving, in a way, a folk wrestling tradition from rural northeastern Poland. So these are the two things that I'm mostly preoccupied with in terms of research. And I also have a long-standing interest in one particular manuscript that belongs to the so-called German tradition, medieval German tradition. And this is manuscript 3227A, or what people often colloquially call the Dobringer Codex, which is, as most of you know, it's actually not the correct name, but well, it's pretty recognizable still. Right, so this is where I stand. And I'm also a practicing HEMA coach. I used to be a competitor as well.
So a busy life.
Right, yeah, plus kids.
Yes. So I guess maybe we can start by what made you focus specifically on the one manuscript. Like, what is the fascinating aspect of that compared to any other source?
Okay. Right, yeah, so it started with this particular manuscript a long time ago. In my case, it was late 2008 when I started actually reading it for the first time on my own, because sometime earlier I joined a study group, a HEMA study group, that was led by Bartłomiej Walczak, a fellow scholar and one of HEMA pioneers, not only in Poland, but globally. And at the time, it was a manuscript or this one of the witnesses to the Liechtenauer tradition that received relatively little love, right? It was not very, very known compared to, say, Ringek or Pseudo von Danzig. So I started reading it because it was not very much explored, and that was, actually Bart advised me to look there because I asked him what could I possibly do as a wannabe HEMA researcher. So it started by chance, so to say, but then I got hooked because this manuscript is it is formatted differently than the rest of the Liechtenauer corpus. It has its quirks and its own unique features. So I really enjoyed trying to understand it. And then at some point, because at first, of course, I was treating it as like just another brick in the wall. that is just as an, I read it alongside Peter von Danzig or Ringe gloss, like most people do. And I generally think it's not a bad approach, especially if you're interested in creating a functional fencing system. But then again, when I was preparing to pitch the research proposal for my doctoral studies, almost 10 years ago now, I came across a nice paper written by Matthias Johannes Bauer, who is a HEMA researcher and a historical linguist working with medieval German. And there he showed convincingly in that paper that we actually can't assume similar knowledge between sources using similar vocabulary just based on this vocabulary alone. Right? Because many terms that look similar or the same may actually vary in content significantly, right? So he, admonished future HEMA scholars, including me, as it turns out, to treat each fight book as a semantic microcosm, so to say. Right? So he warned against drawing comparisons too early, before we really understand the specific way a particular fight book author used these words, right? So I took this warning seriously, and this is why I decided that I'll stop, dealing so much with comparisons, and I decided to focus on one manuscript.
And how has this changed your approach to HEMA? Because the comparison approach is the one I have seen the most, as far as I've met people. Like, it seems to be the standard, and understandably, but this kind of opens up a whole new framework in terms of understanding. So yeah, how has it changed your approach?
Right. Yeah, it certainly opened me to differences and to the cracks within what is easily, seen as a monolithic tradition, right? So I started seeing places where this particular manuscript differs from other fight books, right? This also, got me thinking about that perhaps the other guys that are much more similar to each other, the guys, I mean, the fight book, the Liechtenauer fight book authors, that they are not monolithic as well. But there I lack expertise to confirm it either way. But but the most important thing would be that it opened me to this possibility.
Do you have any quick and easy example of these differences, and something that struck you as and really made a difference in noticing it?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that's easy to spot when you assume this approach is that people doing Liechtenauer commonly use the concepts of Vorschlag and Nachschlag and Vor and Nach as important concepts within this tradition. But what many people actually overlook is that Vorschlag and Nachschlag appear only in manuscript 3227a. They are not used in by later glossators. And interestingly, for this manuscript author, Vorschlag and Nachschlag are for and nach. They are not like part of this. They are like the whole concept of for lies in the Vorschlag, and the whole concept of nach lies in the Nachschlag, which like makes it very, very different, at least potentially. Perhaps they can be reconciled somehow. I'm not convinced yet, but there are people trying to do this, and I think, well, that it might be done. But from where I stand at the moment, it seems that it's a different conception of for and nach that's used later, right? So that's one thing. But there are more, of course.
And the differences you've seen are due to distance and time, let's say. So different generations approach the words differently, or is there even a geographic kind of element to that, and maybe different interpretations of words?
Right. No, I actually I don't think geography has much to do with it, because at least in the 15th century, the Liechtenauer corpus is like pretty much coherent in terms of geographic origin. Sometimes like really close, centering around the Nuremberg area and what can be called like southeastern Germany. So not there, but yeah, one possibility is that it's a matter of chronology, because manuscript 3-7a is earlier than the later fight books. Depending on how you date it, it may be earlier by up to 2 generations, which is quite a lot. Like quite a lot can happen in 2 generations, and also these 2 generations or 1 generation, because it's at least 1 generation actually. So even 1 generation was a lot at the turn of the 14th and 15th centuries in this particular part of the world, because it was really a transitional period in many respects, with historical changes accelerating in many areas, from fashion to craftsmanship, proto-industry, to social structures. So many things were happening real fast at the time. Give me a sec, I need to let in the cat, okay?
Absolutely. In the meantime, welcome Julian. Hi. And well, I'll just remind everyone to like and subscribe if you haven't yet. And as I mentioned in my comment opening, I have a Patreon, so feel free to join if you want. Let's get back to the conversation.
Yeah, sorry, she always does it.
Timing.
In 10 minutes, I'll probably need to let her out because she's always...
No worries. Yeah, that's perfectly fine. Now that you mentioned this kind of big moment of change and like cultural shift and how important 1 generation is, even at the time, when talking about the topic for tonight and kind of what to talk about, you mentioned that, yeah, one of the things you're quite passionate about is the connection between the source and its social cultural context. So what does the source, and specifically the one you study, but maybe sources in general, how can they help us connect to a broader past than just techniques for fighting and
Right. Okay. That's a layered question, but to put it simply, the most important reason why this context is important is that fighting is a complex practice, because it requires not only a skilled body, and a skilled body is what can be called a cultured body, that is not just a random body, not just meat, right, or flesh, but it's this flesh that was subjected to certain discipline over a prolonged period of time, right? So it is already in a way a cultural artifact. It has been shaped by certain culture. That's one thing. So and also fighting with weapons is something that requires the material artifacts that need to form a functional unit together with this skilled body, right? And these artifacts again are shaped by a particular culture. They also carry some meanings, etc., right? So it's if we are interested in actually understanding a past fighting culture or a fighting system, however you call it, we need to take these things into account. Because of course, if you're just interested in creating a modern fighting art with historical weapons tailored for modern challenges and needs, then you don't need that almost at all, or maybe not that much, right?
Yeah.
But this is not what I'm interested in. So if you take this kind of stance when you really want to learn about the past, then you must understand these things, right? Yeah. So that would be the short answer, I think.
Yeah. And where do you think, at least for you, but in general, if we look at the modern HEMA environment, let's say, where do you think it stops? In the sense that one of the topics I've had with a lot of the people I've talked to in these conversations is the authenticity of reproductions in terms of performance, both like weight balance, but even the kind of metal it's made with, the movements. So at what point do you think, up to what point are you willing to go, in a sense, to keep that kind of historical context alive? And where do you say, okay, we're in 2025? So
Right. Yeah. So, I actually had to ask myself this question during my doctoral research because I was lucky to enter a doctoral course at a pretty unusual faculty at the University of Warsaw, where they were open to like really experimental projects. Experimental meaning that unorthodox, right? Not like scientifically experimental.
yeah.
But that too, of course, but that wasn't my approach. But yeah, so what they allowed me to do was to ask this very question, like when we try to reconstruct past movement culture in this case, to what extent can we claim authenticity, right? So that was my basic question. And because the general consensus at the time when I began my work among historians and archaeologists was that we actually can't claim any authenticity, I wanted to really explore why they think so, and perhaps why how their stance could be countered. So the first part of my dissertation was a theoretical analysis, and then a proposal of a methodology that would allow for reclaiming some kind of authenticity, right? And then they allowed me to do a case study to test this theory. And the case study was me for 12 months. And part of the theory that I developed required me to spend these 12 months surrounded with, an environment that would reproduce key aspects of an environment in which a medieval fighter would sort of, develop. Right. So there, I had like replicas of medieval footwear, of medieval clothing, of the period that would match the chronology and geography of this particular manuscript. I had a replica sword made, but blunt and flexible enough to enable sparring, but otherwise it was like an exact replica of a specific piece that would also fit this context. And here I would like to thank Marek Hellman from BLOS, who kindly just sponsored this sword to me, and nice to have it. It's great. So I surrounded myself with these artifacts, and I also structured my daily routines according to the instructions that could be inferred from contemporary sources contemporaneous with manuscript 3227A that would deal with these matters, especially the so-called sanitary regimens or health regimens that would instruct you how to take care of your body, how to approach effort, sleep, diet, how to combine exercise with your daily life, right? So I followed this. What I didn't do, where where the red line was for me, was that I didn't exactly follow the dietary instructions. In that I didn't replicate, recipes or didn't eat exactly what they told me to eat. Partially because, one thing they would often advise to upcoming fighters would be to eat quite a lot of meat. Actually, too much for me to afford, because it is not cheap, right? So I had to make compromises there. For instance, I supplemented meat diet with like plant-based protein, right? To like sort of keep the proper protein intake, but without actually eating that much meat.
That's
etc.
really interesting, by the way, the aspect of the too much meat, because we tend to think that we're now in an age where meat is cheap and available more than it was, let's say, in many other times in the past. But if a fighter had a diet that even by today's standards is almost unsustainable, that says quite a lot about the monetary effort at the time, probably, to...
Right, yeah. Also, it has to be remembered that this, diet varied wildly in the Middle Ages, right?
Mhm.
In a single, in a single neighborhood, you would have people who would be essentially malnourished most of their lives, and people who would eat really, really good, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because the social ladder, it wasn't flat at all, right? There were large differences, or differences between regions as well.
Mm-hmm. And did you notice any difference then after this year? Like, what was the result of your case study?
Right. Yeah. That's there are many results because this allowed me really to, because essentially for this year the university was paying for me my training actually. Right. So I was able, because I had to follow this regime, and I did, and it amounted to about between 15 and 17 hours of physical exercise a week, spread spread across 6 days a week, right? So it was a pretty intense routine that involved not only fencing but also wrestling, running, weightlifting with stones and stuff, calisthenics, acrobatics, this kind of quite comprehensive physical preparation. So generally, it really positively affected my general physicality. That's one thing. Interesting stuff was that the kind of physical preparation that emerged from following this routine turned out to gravitate more towards high rep and high volume effort in terms of resistance training than what we would call strength max or low rep high volume training, right? And in effect, I saw really considerable gains in strength, endurance, but quite little hypertrophy, which is actually interestingly aligned with what we can infer from the scarce sources that we have on the knightly physicality in the Middle Ages, because knights, it appears that they generally tended to be rather lean, even though strong and generally fit, right? Also, this sometimes escapes people, but generally knights were interested in remaining rather lean and in keeping their body shape more or less stable throughout life, because it's much easier to keep your body in one shape than to change armor whenever you bulk up.
Yeah.
Right. So they would often even use something akin to corsets to tie their waistlines, right, to make them fit into the armor.
Yeah, and especially, I mean, if you're not like a king that can afford, like Henry VIII, you can follow his whole body.
Yeah, that's a different story. But I'm talking about the guys who were the
exactly,
right, not the top.
Yeah, so you have one, if you're lucky, set, and you have to fit
have
into
it after your father, right? And you can't afford buying a new one, so you just need to fit.
This also says a lot about accessibility of the activity, though, of course, because when you say 16, 17 hours a week, but with all the kind of effort and everything, this is definitely not something that can be picked up by anyone who also has to balance, let's say, labor job.
Right.
So how exclusive would it have been in, not so much in social terms, but in the practical, like in the physical terms?
Right. Yeah. I mean, it is really demanding. time-wise, but you also need ample time for rest, right? Because this regime can be nurturing, but it can be destructive. And the difference between one and the other is whether you can rest enough or not, and eat enough, right? So, I mean, this makes it really tangible why, knights needed land estates to support themselves, right? Because why they weren't expected to work, right? But again, that was an ideal. And if we look at southern Germany in the 14th and early 15th century, you would see that their knighthood wasn't monolithic. They had like social divisions there, and these social divisions were not only about prestige and status or whatever, but about the tangible day-to-day existence and conditions in which these people lived. And the bulk of Southern German knighthood at the time were like lowly knights, many of them descendants of the so-called ministeriales, which is like courtly serfs, actually. And it's a group that often escapes our attention today, because we are accustomed to think about knights in through the lens of Arthurian romances, generally through the lens of the Western knighthood, like French knighthood, English knighthood. But German knighthood was a bit different in that regard. And these lower knights, they were often actually unfree. So they couldn't marry, without their lord's consent. Actually, their lords would often just choose wives for them. If they had land at all, this land was not heritable, right? So it would return to the lord upon their death. The kids could not just automatically claim it. They would be even sent off as presents, to other monarchs, or during as diplomatic gifts, essentially. Right?
Okay.
And they were expected to be fighting men, right? To provide their lords with the basic fighting power. So they had to train, and their lord's chief responsibility, was to sort of take care of them. So they had to give them shelter, they had to give them food and time to train. But this worked well only as long as the rulers could, rely on wars and raiding to pay off these knights, right? When this was not so easy, the things started to crumble.
Yeah, and talking about the non-hereditary aspect of the role, how would then the ranks be refilled generation after generation? Was it open in a sense to entering as a career, or do you know how it worked?
Right. Yeah, it also differed across time, because let's say when you look at the times of Frederick Barbarossa, it was a time when the ranks of these lower knights or lower knighthood were relatively open still, but it changed during his rule due to a combination of factors. But it was different then. So generally, usually sons of these lower knights were expected to follow their father's footsteps in a way. But it either happened or not, but in most cases probably it did. So that was the main way. But also the lords could elevate people to this status, right? For different kind of merits or achievements. So that's another way.
Yeah, so perhaps you wouldn't receive the land of your father, but you still were required, in a sense, to continue the job.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That's right.
Okay.
And earn it again, for instance, right? Or
yes, that's tough.
That's tough. And they were really frustrated at some point, like these lower knights. There was like real societal tension going on there.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Every time you add a little piece of the kind of social puzzle, some things are confirmed, but then you have way more complexities that kind of build up the picture. One thing that you mentioned was the difference between what we tend to see as like Western knighthood, which is heavily influenced by France and England often. And this is a topic that's been coming out often, even in terms of sword analysis. With James Elmsley, he was talking about kind of this gap we have when we look at messers and falchions with Central and Eastern Europe, for instance, where we don't know much because of, political walls that were there over time. How big do you think this gap is in our current, like, how important is that blind spot we tend to have when we look at medieval history from a more lighthearted approach?
Well, that's an interesting question, but I don't think I'm qualified to give you, a solid answer. There is certainly a gap, right? And but it also, it depends on whom you ask, because if we're talking about the popular view, right, then the gap is huge, right? If you start asking people in the know, then of course it becomes much smaller. Right. One obstacle is, of course, that there is a lot of literature in German and a lot of literature in Czech or in Polish, right, which does not circulate well in the Anglo-Saxon, circles. There are, of course, people like Benjamin Arnold who are like tirelessly trying to, bridge this gap. Arnold wrote a great book on German knighthood. I can recommend it. And it's in English, so there's a lot of good stuff to be digged there. Right. Yeah, but this gap, it's still huge, I think.
So probably there's a lot more we can learn. It's the gift that keeps on giving, history, I think. The other topic you mentioned, and I think we already kind of went over it a little bit, was the philosophy and method. Let me read it. It was philosophy and methodology of embodied historical research. So this definitely fits your doctoral work that you mentioned. What do you think the further opportunities are for this kind of active approach, let's say, of living? I don't want to say living history, maybe, but it has another meaning, maybe. But yeah, you get what I mean, like the approach you use.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Well, generally, it's for a longer talk, but there is something that is now commonly known as experimental archaeology, right? Which is like designing, like proper experimental archaeology is using the scientific method to, replicate certain processes that can be inferred this way or another from the historical or an archaeological record to gain further insights, and especially to falsify hypotheses. Or when we fail to falsify them, then they can be upheld for a time, right? So that's a specific subset of the archaeological method. But by design and how the way it's actually applied, experimental archaeology is about artifacts, not about people. Right? So we try to infer and learn how materials behave, how tools interact with objects. And also experimental archaeology is usually confined to short-term trials. Right? Now, what people colloquially call experimental archaeology is like any kind of living history, right? Well, this is frowned upon by academics because it's like overstretching the term a little bit. Right. And what I see as embodied historical research differs from experimental archaeology in that it is centered on the people and especially on the skilled bodies. Right. And as such, it needs to factor in much longer time than typical experimental archaeology. So it uses what is like in the jargon, it's called the longitudinal study design, right? Where we don't focus on short trials, but allow like months or sometimes years to let the processes unfold, right? So the implication that's pretty important. Actually, I was 2 weeks ago, I was surprised at an archaeology conference to learn about a larger European Union-backed archaeological project on prehistoric maritime, how do you pronounce it?
Maritime, I think.
Maritime
Yes.
societies that's using my methodology.
Really?
So it can be, it turns out flexible enough to go beyond like movement culture in the narrow sense or fighting arts, and can be applied to different kind of, embodied skills, which is nice, right? And the main thing there, I believe, is that by this shift in attention towards longer study designs, you can sort of work around the problem of authenticity, understood as, replicating a past state, which we can't do. We can't move as a medieval person, much less be a medieval person. This is impossible, right? But what we can do when we allow enough time, we can sort of see what's the trajectory between my current, my starting state of my body, say, and what does following, say, a medieval health regimen does to it, right? And then this trajectory becomes informative because it shows the direction of change from who I am now and who I could potentially become if I followed this regimen for, a lifetime, right? So we can't recreate past states, but we can infer important information about, the effect of these practices on bodies. So this is what it does.
This is really interesting. Well, this focus you keep mentioning bodies. It kind of reminds me a little of my philosophy studies, the focus on bodies of Michel Foucault. He's more of a postmodern, so definitely not as, I think, scientifically solid, perhaps. But it's really interesting how the effect of politics, in a sense, or society on the body is something that is tangible. And it's really interesting. We tend to look at it as something in the past that we can kind of think about or talk about. But from what I'm hearing from you, instead, it's something that we can, to an extent, rebuild, or at least within certain controlled variables, recreate. So does this extend, for example, if I think about, I was recently at a medieval market, like in Switzerland, a couple of days event. And I know this was really short, but I mention it because the feeling you get when you wear the clothing, and as you mentioned, the shoes, the effect that the feeling you have, for example, walking on a modern road on asphalt with these shoes and then walking instead on grass or gravel really teaches something. And do you think, how much potential is there for longer term studies of this kind? Because it would be amazing, I think, to be able to rebuild some kind of thing like that on an ongoing basis, but I don't know how realistic it is.
Yeah, I mean, I believe that there is going to be more studies like this, but experimental archaeology is now an established subfield of archaeology, but it wasn't so like 2 decades ago. It was ridiculed, thought of as just play pretend, generally nothing serious, but it grew to become something serious. And I think this kind of embodied methodologies will also, take a foothold in the academic world. So perhaps we're gonna see more studies like this, especially that for a very long time historians were interested in what's often called event history. So they were studying who did what and when and to whom and for what reasons, right? So they focused on what can be called narrative sources, that is, sources that would tell the story of events, right? But for some time already, historians has been like shifting attention, or some historians have been shifting attention to what is called non-narrative sources, or sometimes technical literature or artisanal sources, such as notebooks of craftspeople. And these don't tell any story, right? When you have a list of ingredients and a set of instructions how to combine them, well, in a way, it is a story, right? But it is not a story of an event. It is something that refers you to the material world outside of the text and claims what's going to happen if you do this or that. So essentially, they are like experimental protocols waiting to be replicated, right? And historians started dealing with those as well.
And is there an advantage in using these? Because, of course, they probably don't have the narrative bias that instead kind of narrative-based sources do have instead, because whether you're trying to tell an event, you're imbuing it with your own experience or biases. But if I'm just writing recipes, it's like a fairly objective text to a certain extent of
right.
how we can use the word. So do you think by taking text or sources that are, let's say, fairly objective with a big asterisk, even non-academic experimenters can bring value to these tests? Because, for example, you mentioned recipes, and I'm thinking about all the YouTube channels that do recreation of medieval or Roman recipes and stuff. But of course, it's more entertainment than research. So do you think there's a little bit of overlap there, or are there like some guidelines to maintain the thing academic rather than not?
Well, yeah, of course there are, because, one reason for that is that academics want, they want to feel special, right? So they develop these, gatekeeping measures, right? But yeah, jokes aside, of course, recipes, they are more like objective than narrative sources in a way, but it's not that they can be, that they don't require interpretation, right?
Yeah.
They do. The basis thing is, of course, vocabulary, right? The ingredients are, sometimes named in ways that are not, immediately obvious, right? So you need to understand those. They sometimes reference, certain cultural concepts that are important and has to be, understood before you can proceed properly. So that's one reason. But generally, the community of artisanal historians, let's call them this way, is generally interested in what lay people are doing, right, with this amateur research, partly because they still struggle to get, funding for their research. So what the amateurs are doing with their own money and their own time can actually be used as a sort of data by historians, not uncritically, but it can be useful, and it is used. Right. For instance, a historian can analyze a bunch of these reconstructed recipes and see the results, compare them, and then really have a deep look at the actual source. And then they can, sometimes it saves them a lot of time because they see, okay, this is bullshit, and this is also bullshit. So perhaps let's not do this and do something else, right?
Almost reminds me of more practical public history in a sense, like more hands-on. Yeah, very. By the way, do you, of all the hats you wear, what do you feel fits the best? Are you more of an anthropologist, an archaeologist, a practitioner?
Okay, I haven't thought about this actually. I don't know. I like all of them. Probably the one I actually like the least is the anthropologist, but that's not because I don't like anthropology. I think it's great, and it actually taught me a lot after I started like really pursuing it. But the reason is that I think of myself as an archaeologist, and I call what I do, what I did with manuscript 3227A and this whole study, I call it archaeology of motion. Because I see motions as material artifacts, only with very specific, very ephemeral materiality. But still, I approach them just like other archaeologists approach pots or tools, whatever, other artifacts. But well, that doesn't sit very well with many archaeologists, right? So many archaeologists don't see this as proper archaeology. So
Yeah,
just stubborn, and I like it, because they don't want me to be an archaeologist, so I want to be an archaeologist.
yeah, I can. Yeah, I mean, the focus on the material aspect in archaeology is definitely very important for a lot of people. So I can see why there would be some pushback. But I mean, we do have the description of movements. We do have, and another thing I wanted to ask, by the way, just a quick hello to Rafael Kalus. So, hi, thank you for joining us.
Miło, że jesteś.
And when we talk about bodies, movement, we have the sources, we have the reconstructions we can, like you do through your methodology, but we also have depictions like effigies and images. Is that something that is important for you in your research as a source, or what are the caveats, if any, you have when looking at artwork? Because
like,
when you were mentioning
artwork is you need to be cautious, but it is very useful, because even if medieval artwork, as most people already realize, at least in HEMA, so while medieval artwork is by no means photographic, it is still a sort of representation of reality, right? It speaks its own language, but it's a language that you can understand, at least in broad strokes. Right, so it can provide important information if you're careful. But with my particular case, that is manuscript 3227A, it is unillustrated. So iconography was never my chief focus because of this, right? But then again, it's useful indirectly, because as I told you, I needed to like really pinpoint the material culture that surrounded this manuscript, including cloths, footwear. So iconography is indispensable there, right? Because this is where we learn about these things.
And when we look moving away from the body and back, unfortunately, into the object, when we look at, let's say, equipment of the time that still exists in museums or collections, at weapons of the time, how important can the variations in like length, hilt, length, weight, balance point be? And because I feel like a lot of times we see them as interesting, but if they don't kind of build a trend, they're just set aside as, oh, okay, this is maybe the guy was tall or maybe he was heavy or whatever. But there's a lot of variation lots of times. There's not, it's, so do you see value even, let's say, in that kind of analysis applied to your methodology?
Yeah, absolutely. Because, as I told at the beginning, motion cultures, they sort of emerge from body cultures and material cultures. And of course, like social culture, right? So it's important to understand the object that like co-shaped these practices. And now, it was also important for my work with the manuscript, because again, it comes from a specific period and a specific region of Germany or Europe. And this region was actually, in many respects, well, I don't want to say unique, but it was like it has its own specificity. One thing being that it was actually the largest European metallurgy hub, second only to that around Milan, right? But that was south to the Alps. So it was the largest north to the Alps. And also in the 14th and 15th century, it was quickly recovering after the Black Death. So it was, as I told you, it was a transitional period in many respects. One of them was like proto-industrialization of metallurgy. Lots of discoveries happening. Also the slow introduction of gunpowder at the turn of the 14th and 15th century, which changed like a lot. And it was all happening there. It was also a region where the alchemical thought was very vivid at the time, because it was tied to all these changes in industry and gunsmithing, gunpowder, and other things. So it had its specificity. And now the manuscript is about fighting with a sword. So a sword is deceitfully easy to understand, right? Because everyone knows what a sword is. And many people tend to assume a very broad perspective on swords, and they sort of throw them all in one bag. And this can mask certain important trends. Because if we just look at medieval swords indiscriminately, without paying close attention to their place of origin or their intended users, right? Because sometimes swords were produced in one place, but intended for another place and accommodated to their tastes, their needs, right, etc. Right. So if we ignore these things, then actually the medieval sword becomes like an amorphous thing. It can be short, it can be long, it can be light, it can be heavy, right? Yeah. It can have a long blade and a short grip, or a long grip and a short blade. You can make whatever you want out of it.
Yeah.
But this does not correspond to reality if we take a more, granulated or more precise look. And now, one thing that I did during my doctoral research for the manuscript was that I gathered quite a lot, almost 400 swords with either completely preserved dimensions or dimensions that could be easily inferred from their current state, that would classify as the so-called long swords, right? So that would accommodate being used with two hands. And what was interesting when I did statistics on it was that there was a clear difference in terms of dimensions between swords from this period, that is the turn of the 14th and 15th centuries, coming from southern Germany, or specifically from Passau, and the background, the rest of the swords.
Okay.
Right? And the swords from southern Germany, they are generally much longer. Right? They are proper long swords in the way we understand them. Right? So this is a kind of difference that gets obscured if you don't look, carefully on lower level.
Have you been able to kind of hypothesize on why there's this difference specifically from the Passau area versus everyone else, let's say?
Yeah. So, well, first we can look at why this was possible at all, right? Because if you look at swords from the 11th or 12th, maybe let's say 12th, 13th century, we sometimes have specimens with really long blades, but they are one-handed swords, right? They are not yet like long swords. But generally, these longer blades are exceptions. And many of those that survived were actually rather, of those that survived, these long blades, several has been like really analyzed properly with the metallographic methods, right? That could establish the steel quality, etc. And now I'm speaking from memory, so I won't die on this hill, but I would say, speaking from memory, that most of them are rather shoddy work, and perhaps they survived specifically because they were just useless, or maybe not very useful, right, as weapons. So they were not used, and perhaps that's why they survived up to this day, right? So what I want to say here is that they were experimenting already at the time with creating longer blades, but they really experienced technological difficulties because of the way they processed steel, the kind of raw material they could access, etc. Right? And now in southern Germany, which was this metallurgical hub at the time, apparently they made a technological breakthrough and started being able to consistently produce decent quality long blades. And now, interesting thing is that this long blades, they did not connect to longer grips. They were, of course, a bit longer so that you could fit two hands, but they tended to be much shorter than what we see on modern Federschwerter, for instance, that we use for our own trainings as HEMA people, right? Or in competitions. Because, nowadays you can have like 30 centimeters handle, right? Counting the pommel. But these swords, if you had 23 centimeters, it was a really long grip.
Yeah, which is not much. Yeah.
Right. And also, most feathers today tend to have like pear-shaped pommels or fishtail pommels because they are really, really comfortable. And you can then extend the grip even more because you can comfortably grab this pommel. But these weren't invented yet in the early 15th century. We just don't have those, right? So they had flat disc pommels mostly, which do not sit in the hand as comfortably, especially in certain positions, right? So these long blades had rather short and not so comfortable grips from our perspective, right? So when you start working with this kind of tool, it affects the kind of techniques that you will, find comfortable or even possible to perform.
So if we take it as a bit of a chicken and egg kind of scenario, was the long blade more a development of technology that enabled longer blades, or was there a desire for longer blades that was kind of just waiting for the technology to be able to really explode?
Well, probably we won't ever know for sure. But, from the examples that we have of these earlier swords that I mentioned, it seems that at least some swordsmiths, and by extension also potential sword users, they tried to push for longer swords, right? They just couldn't get it right yet.
So it's almost like what happens with the rapier only a few centuries before, like the continuous extension until you need to change the technique and like the whole interesting. And if we go into modern HEMA now, how does all of this, how do you see it applying in a world that is more and more sportified in a sense, or that is becoming, I see it a little bit from the outside, but from what I'm constantly hearing, let's say, it seems to be a common refrain that, so do you see like a lot of openness in the HEMA environment to this kind of approach you have, or do you think that it's already taken a bit of a sport direction and there might be,
Okay, yeah, I think I get what you mean. For me, I'm not buying that much into this history versus sport divide. Right? During my doctoral research, I was unlucky because it fell in the middle of the COVID pandemic. So there was only one event I could attend during these 12 months of training, and my research plan actually assumed at least 4 competitions. So it didn't work out. But during this competition, I did my best to fight according to the instructions I received from manuscript 3227 and the training I underwent over the previous months. And it was in the 9th month of my training, so I was already pretty well into it. I also wore replicas of medieval shoes for this tournament, and they let me do this, right? So in this sense, this environment, at least in Poland, is pretty open to people trying to use like really historically informed technique in modern competition. There is little against it. One thing I couldn't do was to use this replica sword.
Okay.
Because it was too heavy, according to the rule set, and I couldn't use it.
Okay.
Right. So, but I mean, this is reasonable because these 14th century swords they varied in mass, but the median turns out pretty high. So it was above 1 kilogram and 700 grams, right? And so it's on the heavier end. Nowadays, in some places, you could actually use a sword this heavy, but not everywhere, right? So so that's one thing, right? But that's the practical part of it. But if we are veering more towards philosophy of it, then I believe that it all depends on the practitioner intentions, right? Because you may just want to play a specific rule set and have your fun there, but you can also try to test particular interpretations in combat. This is what I did and I keep doing, and you can gain important insights as a researcher for your interpretations, regardless of the rule set you're playing. It may mean that you won't probably look very well on the scorecards because of certain artifacts of this or that convention. But if you approach it as a researcher, then it is always data that you can work with. For instance, when you're investigating a fighting system like this from the manuscript 3227A, it addresses a number of questions or situations that can happen in combat according to the author, right? And then you take this system with its questions and answers to a competition, and you may see that it either covers all situations that you encountered, or that perhaps there are situations that are not covered by this system, right? And then you can ask yourself a question, okay, why isn't this covered? Or perhaps it is, but somewhere between the lines, right? So this brings you back to your historical research and investigating the context. It can also sometimes change your interpretation of particular techniques, because one thing that what happened to me while I was researching it was that in the manuscript 3227A, it seems to assume that most of your footwork should be passing steps, and I'm not only talking like attacking, but maneuvering, right? Distance management, but also with passing steps. And now you can do it in a way that makes you very vulnerable to opponents' timed actions in preparation, like leg strikes or thrusts in preparation. And this happens when your passing step moves your center of balance forward already when you begin the step, because then you are quickly in the point of no return. You must finish the passing step before you can, for instance, retreat, right?
Yeah.
But when you recognize this problem in sparring or in competition, then you may start designing ways to actually make the passing step in a way that won't have this vulnerability, or that would minimize this vulnerability. And I found these ways, right? And this allowed me to like compete decently with, despite using this archaic footwork, right?
Interesting.
Right? So these insights bring you back to your source with new data, and you can read it again from this perspective.
One thing that came to mind when you were mentioning the fact that they didn't let you use the sword, in your training and sparring during this year, were you using modern gear, or was even your training, like the physical aspect of it, more historical?
Right. Yeah. So it was mixed, because when I took individual lessons with Krzysztof Janus, whom I want to thank again here, I would wear medieval footwear, and I would use no mask for most exercises and no gloves, except from those like most dangerous when we were drilling like risky actions like counterattacking in an incoming strike or whatever, right? So I try to avoid using these modern protection as much as possible. I would also use the replica sword for the lessons, for sparrings, for working, for the dummy work, right? And for some sparrings, especially against like strong opponents, like physically strong opponents, I would wear the modern gambesson. For others, I would just wear the historical replica doublet that I had. And this was my torso protection.
And did you notice any big difference in your approach to movement and in your approach to fencing when using like historical replica versus modern gear or hybrid?
Yeah. There was quite a lot, but this must be remembered. It must be remembered that these differences, if they appear in the context of a particular fencing system, right? Because there might be systems that won't change much, but others may change, and it was the case with manuscript 3227A. So there were many things. First of all, because of manuscript's emphasis on like narrowing your emotions as much as possible, it became a problem at one point that when you are wearing gloves, like sparring gloves, your forearm becomes real thick because of the layers of protection with the cloth, right? And then you have the cuff of the glove, which means that, for instance, you can't keep your elbows as close together as you can without the protection, right? So, and this affects, your technique, especially if you're fighting with a long sword with short grip, and you are not allowed to grab the pommel because the manuscript explicitly tells you not to do it. Right, so your hands need to be really, really close together, and being able to keep your forearms real close to each other becomes important for technique, because without it you lose a lot of mobility that's required to perform certain actions. So that's one thing. Also, generally, the gear can hinder your mobility, right? And certain actions are much less comfortable, and because of it, sometimes avoided when you're under pressure, right? Whereas without it, you could be using them much more. So that's one thing. The other thing is that if you're wearing a early 15th century doublet that's tailored properly, it should also squeeze your waistline like a corset, right? And this also affects, and the doublet is tied to your hose, meaning that and hose is like a big sock. So if you, for instance, bend, you hinge in the hips, at some point the strings at the back of your hose will start to pull your doublet unless you untie them. And actually we see this on some fencing iconography, that they have these rear strings untied, potentially specifically because of this reason, right? So these little things just become apparent and important only when you start doing the stuff in proper gear, because otherwise they are easy to overlook.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. When you mentioned the fact that
Sorry, I think I lost you.
oh, am I back? I can see you and hear
Okay,
you.
yeah, I got you back.
Okay, perfect. When you mentioned the fact that due to following the source, you couldn't use the like hold the pommel. Have you had any other examples of this kind of very clear limitation from the past that maybe today we just ignore because, well, why not hold the pommel if you can? But if you're trying to really follow the source, it changes things considerably.
Sorry, the voice got jagged a little.
Oh, okay,
and
yeah.
I lost half of your question.
Yeah, I was asking if there
Could
were
you
other
repeat?
examples. Yeah, if there are other examples like the one you mentioned about not being able to hold the pommel, where you really notice how a more modern approach that has the luxury of ignoring certain aspects or bypassing them doesn't notice maybe, but if you do hold to the source very strictly, you see a big difference.
Right. Yeah. Also, the weight of the sword is a factor, and also the width of the blade. And actually, these two factors combined, they make a difference for the system that I studied. And I think similar things could happen with other systems, right? Because and it's not because of things most people assume. Because when we have a look at archaeological swords from the period, they tend to be rather heavy, as I told you earlier. But it doesn't mean they are forward heavy or tip heavy. Even really heavy swords, like above 2 kilograms from the period, they have a point of balance around 8 centimeters from the crossguard. And if you handle them, and I did, then they really like stick to the hand, and you have really nice point control. You don't feel the weight that much. But they are also, they were likely not designed to be like heavy cutters. And it's also not the kind of fencing that the manuscript 3227A endorses, right? It's very thrust centric with emphasis on narrow motions and like really keeping your point control, right? So now, if you have a heavier blade with a heavy wide blade, then but properly balanced with good point control because of this balance, then you actually can afford, for instance, taking your parries really narrowly, because your sword has enough inertia to stop incoming attacks without you overcompensating by moving your hand more to the side, right? So and I could feel it. I even quantified it at some point, like tentatively, that after fighting with the replica sword for a while and then switching to the feather, I would receive a lot of hits because I would get smashed through the parries because I was doing them too narrowly. They worked just fine with the heavier sword and the wider blade that I could turn to create a shield, right? But if the blade is thin and light, it's not enough. You need to move your hand more to the side to close the parry properly. Right? And this, again, translates to technique.
Really interesting. I'll quickly just let who's here know that we're in the last 15 minutes. So if you have questions for Maciej, this is your moment to ask them. I mean, you can always ask them in the comments later on, but now you can answer live. If one were to be interested in developing kind of better understanding this kind of research you do and the methodology you work with, is your work published? Is it available? Is it something that's easily accessible?
Right, parts of it, because I had a few papers like sort of extracted from my dissertation and published separately. So there is a paper on archaeology of motion that sort of outlines the basic method. There are also some papers on the manuscript 3227A. One is, I was promised that it's going to appear this November. It's about the dating of the manuscript and some like remarks on its socio-cultural context. Well, yeah. So pieces are available, and generally I try to publish in periodicals that are open access, so you don't have to go through a paywall to access these
That's
things.
Very nice of
but
you.
now currently I am preparing my doctoral dissertation to be published as a book.
Okay, cool.
This also requires me to shorten it by like about 200 pages because it was almost 600 pages long. I need to fit it in 400 pages. So hopefully it will appear next year.
Nice. And the 400 swords you mentioned that you gathered the data about, did these become an integral part of your research, or was it just nice to have and like interesting, but
no, it was a must, because I had, as I explained earlier, I had to really pinpoint the material objects that had to accompany the bodily practices that I was interested in. Yeah, so I had to do it in order to actually answer the question, what kind of sword is expected by this source?
And where were you able to find, like, what are the sources for these swords, more or less?
Right. There's been a lot of meticulous research on this done by other scholars in Poland and in Czech Republic and also elsewhere. But the biggest compilations that I had access to were by Polish scholars and the Czech scholars, and they studied swords from Polish collections, from Czech and Slovak collections, from German collections, right? So I based this mostly on the literature and their documentation, but I also had a few study visits to certain museums, either to document new swords or to handle some of those swords that I found in the literature.
Okay. Was it difficult to kind of reconcile different databases with different kind of structure? Was it?
Yeah, it was. Yeah. It wasn't that easy because especially that some of these publications are from the 1980s or 1990s, or even those from the early 2000s. Sword scholars have only recently recognized the importance of something like the point of balance and other dynamic measurements, right? They weren't taken earlier, right? So even if in a 1990s publication you may have like a lot of swords documented in terms of their length, particular dimensions of this or that element of the sword, but you will rarely find information not only about point of balance but also about the weight of the specimen, right? So how do you work with that if you're interested in their dynamic properties, right? But it started to change. So in the newer publications, especially the great work by Jiří Hošek and his team, they are already including these dynamic parameters. So this makes my work and others much easier. But it has only recently started to change.
Yeah, it's a very exciting world in that sense. We have a couple of questions, so we'll get to them in these last 10 minutes. Sure. So Mike Graham asks, if you can get into some more specifics about your observations on historic techniques from the manual, perhaps more about making passing steps work well and how tied back to rereading.
All right. Yeah, I could go on the fencing from manuscript for a long time. So I try to focus on the second part of your question, okay? Because we need to sort of squeeze it in the time frame. So passing steps generally have the inherent problem compared to what we consider the normal fencing footwork. In that the normal fencing footwork is great for changing direction, right? Because you can easily plant whichever foot you want almost anytime you want, and then push with it or pull with it in order to propel your body, in the desired direction. Especially, if we're talking like sort of more or less linear motion, right? With a passing step, there are many ways to do it that will, make you really slow compared to this normal footwork to change direction, right? Because, you need to move your rear foot past your front foot, then the rear foot becomes the new front foot. It has to land, and only then you can start withdrawing it if you moved your center of balance together with the step, right? And this is a big problem for any fencer faced with a decent distance managing opponent with normal footwork, right? So I had this problem at the early stage of my work with this system. I was beaten a lot because of this, right? So what I changed was that I learned to start the passing step by moving my rear foot forward, but without committing my weight yet, right? So the front foot was not loaded, it was light, right? So if the opponent tried to time their action to the beginning of my passing step, I was able to withdraw the foot, right, and not give them the distance that they expected to get, right? So this allowed me not to maybe change direction, but to abandon the step if needed, right? And this made my life much easier, even against competent opponents, right? But this required a return to the source to see if there's anything there that helps tackle the problem. And the thing that actually inspired me to do this is a footwork piece or technique that's there, and it's called abtreten, meaning the motion where you just withdraw the front foot back towards your body, which seems to be like one of the chief ways this author imagines retreating from the opponent. It wasn't visible to me earlier or obvious.
Would this be retracting the foot to square with the other foot, like just retracting it, or moving back the whole step, like?
That one does not exclude the other.
Okay. Yeah.
Right? Because if you're stepping back, the initial part of the motion is just this, retracting the foot towards your body.
Yeah.
And you can stop there, or you can follow through to the full passing step.
Okay. Cool. We have one question also by, so I hope, Mike, that answers your question. And Javier from Mendoza, Argentina, hi. How does risk perception shape HEMA today versus our sources?
Right, yeah. Again, our sources are, they are not monolithic. So this may differ, right? So let's acknowledge this at the very beginning. But yeah, now I believe that we, thanks to the protective gear that we have and flexible weapons, we can afford more. And we can afford more in two ways. Because one thing is that we can risk more ourselves. That is, we can, suck up more damage without, being crippled for life or dead. But also we can afford, or we can risk more in terms of crippling the opponent or the partner, right? And both things are important, because back in the day, one thing is that you might, be fearful of the point of the sword of the opponent or of being wounded more than we are now. which was certainly the case if they fought with sharps. But you would also be wary of injuring the other person, because Middle Ages was not like wild west. Murder was still murder, and if you killed a guy and their family found out, then you would have to either run away or kill that family, because they would probably try to kill you, or if not kill, then they would cause trouble with the authorities or with the community. Generally, you would have a lot of trouble. So, well, people were not exactly very eager to kill each other, right? And the situation that is commonplace in our sparrings, where we really try to outsmart the other guy and land a solid, debilitating, hit, was not at all common back in the day, right? They were training for this, some of them, but their access, actual access to these situations was probably more limited in a way than we have now, right?
And by these situations,
my answer.
By these situations, you mean also sparring, in the sense that now that you were talking, I'm thinking.
No. I mean, okay, that might not be obvious. Let me try to clarify. What I mean is that, if you prepare for a life and death situation, but you don't have like a fencing mask or some of the protection that we now take for granted, it means that your training by necessity must be restrained.
Yeah.
Right? You don't want to injure your training partner, because if you do, then you have no training partner now, right?
Yeah.
So you need to take care of them, and they need to take care of you, right? So you can't, let's take a specific example. Let's say thrust with a disengage, right? The way you can do it nowadays with the protective gear in sparring or in competition is that upon seeing the opponent's attempt to bind, you start disengaging while already extending your hand, leaning with the body and beginning your offensive footwork. This way your timing is really sharp, and the opponent has very little time to do the parry, to change decision, right, and to switch to a parry. And then if you land this, it's a heavy thrust. And if the opponent committed with footwork forward and you happen, for instance, to hit their throat or the mesh of the mask, then it may be even very unpleasant. And sometimes, you can pick a tooth out, right? Or leave the waffle, right? And draw some blood off their face, right? If you did this in training without protective gear, that would be most, impolite. Right. So that's what I mean. Right. Nowadays, we can do these things on a regular basis. So in a way, we have better access to life and death dynamics, right, in our trainings that they could have.
That's an interesting way to see it. Yeah. Okay, in these last couple of minutes, if there are no further questions, is there any tip or like any practical way you think a modern practitioner or historian or someone interested in this kind of world would be able to apply, let's say, your methodology in a way that is like easy to apply, like beginner friendly, so to speak, at least to change their mindset?
Yeah, I mean, it all starts with this semantic microcosm that Matthias Johannes Bauer calls for, right? So if you want to start, the first step is to take a source and try to, for a moment, for a longer moment, assume that it's not connected to other sources and try to understand what it tries to tell you, and really understand its own peculiar language. Because it may be the same language others speak, but it is something that has to be proven first, right? Or it's a productive way to see it. like this, right? And when you start this, then use this source to explore the world from which it emerged, right? So let's use it as a guide to specific socio-cultural reality behind it. And then you can work from there and see what happens.
Very cool. Okay, Maciej, thank you so much for your time. It was really, really eye-opening and very, very interesting. Thank you everyone for joining. And of course, you're welcome. If we haven't touched on the HEMA aspect enough, you're welcome another time to really dive into the techniques. So
sure. That would be a pleasure. So thanks a lot.
Thank you. Have a nice rest of the evening. Bye, and bye everyone.
Bye everyone. Take care.